David Parker stared at the glowing red numbers on the trading screen as his heart pounded. His $5 million investment had vanished within minutes, a fortune swallowed by a market in free fall. He whispered, "This can't be happening," his voice unsteady. Sweat dripped down his temples as his chest tightened, every breath uneven. Around him the trading floor erupted in chaos, phones ringing and papers scattering like leaves in a storm. At 9:32 a.m. the clock ticked forward as if mocking him. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "It's over," her words slicing through the noise. David's body slumped against the chair as despair crept into his bones. The screens blazed with arrows diving lower, dragging his world with them. His fists clenched, veins rising under his skin, but he could not move. The empire he built collapsed before his eyes, leaving only silence in his mind. David staggered from his chair into the corridor, his steps heavy as if the floor itself resisted. His mind replayed the numbers like a cruel film, each loop carving deeper into him. He pressed his back to the cold wall and tried to steady his breath, but his chest only grew tighter. The muffled shouts of traders spilled into the hallway, sharp and distant. He whispered, "5 million gone," each word falling like ash. Years of sacrifice weighed on his shoulders, every lost moment with family now pointless. His knees buckled and he slid down until he was curled against the wall. A janitor walked by, pausing briefly with pity before moving on. David shut his eyes, wishing to wake from this nightmare, but reality clung like chains that could not be broken. David thought of Laura Parker and the promises now broken. His daughter's tuition loomed like a shadow he could not escape. He whispered, "I failed them," voice cracking. The corridor stretched like a tunnel of guilt. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but fear kept his hand still. Another demand, another reminder, another weight he could not bear. He rubbed his face with trembling hands, feeling rough stubble of a sleepless night. The silence pressed around him thicker than stone. His fist slammed against the floor, the sound echoing louder than the chaos beyond. For the first time in years he was powerless. The empire he built stood in ruins, leaving him choking on dust. A voice from behind called, "David, we need to talk," but he could not turn. His legs trembled as he rose, leaning on the wall for strength. He pushed open the stairwell door, the clang echoing sharply. The sounds of chaos faded, replaced by the hollow thud of shoes on concrete. He muttered, "Not yet, not now," refusing to face anyone. Dust and iron filled the air. His reflection on the railing looked alien, worn and defeated. For years he had walked boardrooms with pride, but now each step dragged like chains across stone. He descended slowly, swallowed by shadows. At the bottom, David stopped gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. He whispered, "This is not the end," words foreign yet defiant. His mind screamed failure, yet a spark refused to die. He had lost millions, yet he was still standing. Rivals would celebrate his fall, but anger rose inside. His lips curved into a faint smile, not of joy but rebellion. The storm had broken him, yet storms always pass. He straightened his tie, trembling, yet determined. "I will come back stronger," he vowed, a promise forged in fire. David Parker returned home long after sunset, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock that seemed louder than ever. He dropped his briefcase at the door and stared at the framed photos on the wall. Smiles from vacations, birthdays, and graduations stared back like ghosts of another life. His wife, Laura Parker, had always trusted him with their future, and now that future felt like quicksand. He whispered, "How do I tell her?" His voice cracked under the weight of dread. Upstairs, his daughter's laughter at a television show echoed like a reminder of promises he could no longer keep. The walls of his home seemed to close in, each corner carrying unspoken guilt. His empire had collapsed, but the deepest wound came from knowing he had shattered the foundation of his family's trust. Laura Parker sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea while scrolling through her phone. She looked up as David entered, her eyes calm but curious. "You're late again," she said, her tone even but carrying questions. David forced a smile, lowering himself into the chair across from her. His hands trembled beneath the table as he tried to hide them. Laura tilted her head, noticing the new lines of stress carved into his face. The silence stretched before she added softly, "You look like you've seen a ghost." David swallowed, the truth pressing against his throat, but refusing to come out. The kitchen smelled of chamomile and lemon, but he could only taste dread. Across from him, the woman who believed in him most deserved answers, yet all he gave her was silence shaped like shame. David retreated into his study, closing the door with a quiet click. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp. Books on finance lined the shelves, trophies of past victories now mocking him with silent pride. He dropped into the leather chair, running both hands through his hair. His laptop screen glowed with frozen graphs dipped in red decline. He whispered, "What have I done?" The words filled the air like a judgment. His reflection in the darkened window looked older, broken, and unrecognizable. He thought of every sacrifice, every late night, every deal that had cost him pieces of his soul. Now it was all gone, swallowed by the market in a single, ruthless twist. The silence of the study pressed on his chest, each breath a reminder that the empire he built was nothing but ashes. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds, but for David, it felt harsh and unforgiving. He sat at the breakfast table staring at a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy and untouched. Laura watched him from across the table, concern etched into her face. "David, talk to me," she said gently, her voice both firm and patient. He lifted his head slowly, the shadows beneath his eyes darker than ever. Words clung to his throat like chains, but all he managed was, "I'm just tired." Laura reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding, and filled with unspoken love. Yet it also reminded him of how much he was hiding. The air smelled of coffee and toast, but David could only taste fear. Every moment of silence added weight to the lies he carried, pressing down harder with each breath. Later that day, David walked into his office building with uneven steps and shoulders heavy. The receptionist, Sarah Miller, greeted him with her usual bright smile, unaware of the storm within him. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," she said warmly. David forced a nod, his lips stiff, unable to return her kindness. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected a man who no longer resembled the confident leader he once was. His tie was crooked, his eyes hollow, his posture broken. He whispered, "They cannot know," as if speaking it aloud would make it true. The elevator climbed slowly, each floor's ding a reminder of the mask he had to wear. When the door slid open, David had fixed his expression into a thin mask of composure, but beneath it was a man drowning in silence. David Parker walked into the boardroom, his steps echoing against the polished floor. Around the long table sat the partners he once trusted, their eyes filled with suspicion instead of respect. Papers rustled like whispers of betrayal as Michael Grant, his longtime associate, slid a document across the table. "You signed off without review," Michael said coldly. David's stomach dropped as he scanned the page, realizing signatures had been forged and accounts drained behind his back. His pulse quickened as anger battled despair. For years, Michael had been his closest ally, but the evidence showed a knife hidden in friendship. Laura's face flashed in his mind, and the weight of lies threatened to crush him. He clenched the paper, voice trembling. "You set me up." The room grew heavy with silence, every pair of eyes shifting away. Trust was gone, replaced by the stench of betrayal. Confrontation lingered in David's chest like fire as he stormed out of the boardroom. His mind screamed at the years of trust wasted. Michael's betrayal was sharper than the market collapse, cutting into bone. He leaned against the hallway wall, his breath ragged. Emily caught up to him, eyes wide with concern. "David, you need to calm down," she urged, placing a hand on his arm. He pulled away, his voice sharp, calm. He stole everything. The weight of debt pressed harder, knowing the fall wasn't just misfortune, but a trap set by someone he trusted most. Emma's eyes glistened with pity. but also fear that David was slipping beyond reason. His fists clenched, veins visible as he whispered, "I will make him pay." The hallway buzzed faintly with voices, but David only heard the drum of rage. That evening, David sat in his car parked outside the office, city lights flickering across the windshield. His phone vibrated again and again with calls from creditors, each one unanswered. He stared at the device like it was an executioner's blade. The silence inside the car was broken only by the ticking of the dashboard clock. He whispered, "I cannot let them take everything," voice low and heavy. His reflection in the glass looked haunted, older than his years. Outside, pedestrians walked past unaware of the storm inside him. His debts were snowballing, and tomorrow could bring lawsuits or repossession. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles whitened, the leather groaning under pressure. In that lonely car, David realized he wasn't just fighting the market or betrayal, but the looming collapse of his entire life. The following morning, David entered the bank office, desperation etched across his face. Across the desk sat Charles Miller, a banker with a polished smile masking cold indifference. "We cannot extend your line of credit," Charles said firmly, sliding back the documents. David's hands trembled as he leaned forward. "If you cut me off, everything collapses," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Charles adjusted his glasses, expression unchanging. "Your risk profile is too high." The words struck like a hammer, each syllable closing another door. David's chest tightened as he whispered, "Please, there must be something." Charles only shook his head, finality in the gesture. The sterile office air grew suffocating, the walls closing around David. Another lifeline severed, another betrayal cloaked in professionalism. David left the bank with his shoulders slumped and steps dragging. The city noise seemed distant, muffled by the roar of his thoughts. He wandered through the crowded streets, each passerby a blur of motion against his stillness. In his mind replayed Michael's betrayal, Emma's worried eyes, and Charles' cold refusal. He felt like the world was closing in, pressing him toward a breaking point. A billboard above advertised luxury condos, mocking him with promises he could never touch again. He stopped at the edge of the street, headlights reflecting in his hollow eyes. He whispered, "They want me broken," his voice edged with defiance. For the first time beneath the despair, a spark of fight began to form. The battle was far from over, though the cost was already unbearable. David Parker sat alone in a dim cafe, staring into a cup of untouched coffee. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans and faint jazz from an old speaker. Across from him sat Richard Cole, a man whose reputation had once ruled Wall Street before his fall. Richard, now weathered and jaded, studied David with sharp eyes. "You think you've lost everything," Richard said, his voice rough, "but this is only the beginning of your education." David frowned, his pride clashing with the sting of truth. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The system doesn't care about you. Learn that now or drown." David's pulse quickened as he realized this man, broken yet brilliant, might hold the map to survival. For the first time since the collapse, he felt a flicker of direction, though it came from a fallen guide. Richard lit a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the low light. He smirked bitterly. "I once had it all, David. Private jets, penthouses, influence. Then greed ate me alive, and the market finished the job." David listened, conflicted between pity and fascination. Richard's voice hardened. "They'll use you until nothing's left, then spit you out. The only way to win is to stop playing by their rules." David leaned back, struggling with the thought. His whole career had been built on trust in those very rules. Richard's gaze was sharp, almost predatory. "You want to rise again? Then learn to think like the wolves who tore you apart." The words carried poison and promise, leaving David shaken but unable to ignore the wisdom forged from ruin. Later that week, Emily met David in a quiet park, autumn leaves scattered across the ground. Her voice was calm but firm. "I've seen things, David. Documents, transfers. Michael's betrayal runs deeper than you know." David's chest tightened as she handed him a folder. its weight heavier than paper should be. Inside were records exposing not only Michael, but a network of corruption. "You could bury him with this," Emma said, her tone sharp with urgency. David closed the folder slowly, his jaw tense. "If I use this, I become what I hate." Emma stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. "Or you let them destroy you without a fight." The truth struck harder than the betrayal itself. For the first time, David held a weapon instead of just wounds. That night, David returned to his study, the folder Emma gave him resting on the desk. His hands hovered over it, as if it were a bomb waiting to explode. Richard's words echoed in his head. "Think like the wolves." Emma's voice followed, "Or let them destroy you." The conflict twisted inside him, tearing at his identity. He whispered, "Do I fight dirty or die clean?" His reflection in the window stared back, a man fractured between ethics and survival. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside. He opened the folder again, scanning names and numbers that could ruin Michael and others in one move. His stomach churned, yet for the first time in weeks, he felt power returning to his grasp. The following day, David stood on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. Wind tugged at his jacket as he held the folder close to his chest. He whispered, "This could destroy them all." His heart raced with the weight of choice. He imagined Laura's trusting face, Emma's determined eyes, and Richard's bitter smirk. Each voice pulled him in opposite directions. "I cannot stay the man I was," he muttered, his voice carried away by the wind. The city below bustled, unaware of the storm he held in his hands. For the first time, David was not merely reacting to ruin, he was deciding the next move. His jaw tightened as resolve sparkled in his eyes. The war was no longer about survival. It was about taking back control. David Parker sat in his study with Emily across from him, the folder of evidence spread across the desk. Emma's voice was sharp, her eyes unwavering. "This isn't just about Michael. These transfers link him to investors inside your own company." David's chest tightened as his eyes scanned the records. Betrayal ran deeper than he imagined, poisoning the very core of his empire. He muttered, "It wasn't just him," his voice breaking under the weight of realization. Emma leaned forward, her tone urgent. "They built a trap and left your signature on it. You were meant to fall." The room spun as David gripped the edge of the desk. Rage and disbelief crashed together. For weeks he thought he was careless, but now he saw the truth. It was never just his mistake. It was engineered. The next morning, David confronted Michael Grant in his glass-walled office. Michael looked up from his desk with a smirk, arrogance dripping from every word. "You finally figured it out?" he said coldly. David slammed the folder down, his jaw clenched. "You used me as cover," he growled, voice trembling with fury. Michael leaned back casually, folding his hands behind his head. "You were naive, David. Easy to set up, easy to ruin. Don't take it personally. It's business." David's pulse thundered in his ears. Every word was a dagger, cutting into the years of loyalty and friendship, now turned to ashes. For a moment he wanted to break, but instead his eyes hardened. This was no longer about loss. It was war. Later that evening, David met Richard Cole in a quiet bar, the smell of stale whiskey heavy in the air. Richard's eyes narrowed as David explained the betrayal. "I warned you," Richard muttered, dragging his glass across the counter. David's hands trembled as he said, "They orchestrated everything. They made me their scapegoat." Richard leaned closer, his voice low but sharp. "Then you stop playing fair. You fight them with fire." David's eyes locked onto Richard's, searching for certainty. "If I fight like them, what's left of me?" he asked quietly. Richard smirked, his tone bitter. "You survive, and survival is the only currency that matters." The bar's dim light flickered, echoing the moral shadow David found himself trapped inside. Back in his office, David spread the documents across the table like a battlefield map. Emma stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression fierce. "You have enough here to bury them all," she said firmly. David's eyes scanned the names, the hidden accounts, the layers of deceit. His lips tightened. If I release this, it destroys more than them. It destroys everything. Emma stepped closer, her voice steady but heavy with conviction. Sometimes destruction is the only way to rebuild. David's stomach churned as he looked at her, torn between survival and the ashes of his integrity. For the first time, the choice was his to make, not the markets, not Michael's, not the bank's. His hand hovered over the folder like a trigger. David stood before the window of his high-rise office, the city glowing beneath him. The folder lay on the desk behind him, its power undeniable. His reflection stared back from the glass, a man fractured between ruin and revenge. He whispered, "If I do this, there's no turning back." The hum of the city below rose like a chorus of unseen witnesses. He pictured Michael's smirk, Richard's bitter wisdom, and Emma's burning conviction. The decision weighed heavier than $5 million. It was about identity, survival, and justice twisted together. His jaw tightened as he turned from the glass, resolve burning in his eyes. For the first time since his collapse, David no longer felt powerless. He was ready to act, even if it meant war. David Parker entered the grand conference room, his pulse hammering in his chest. Executives lined the table, waiting for Michael Grant to tighten his grip on power. Instead, David dropped the folder onto the polished wood with a thud that silenced the room. "Everything you've built rests on lies," David said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. Michael's smirk faltered for the first time. Papers spilled across the table, exposing offshore accounts and forged signatures. "This ends today," David declared. Gasps rippled as the executives leaned forward, eyes darting between the evidence and Michael's pale face. Michael rose slowly, anger flashing like a blade. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he snarled. David's jaw tightened. "I know exactly who you are," he shot back, his voice sharp with defiance. The air in the room vibrated with tension, as if the walls themselves braced for war. Michael slammed his fist against the table, his voice rising. "You think you can topple me with paper? I own this company." David met his rage with silence before replying calmly, "Not anymore. They know the truth." Emma Lee stepped from the back of the room, her presence commanding. "We verified the documents," she announced, her voice sharp and clear. The executives shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty cracking under the weight of truth. Michael's face reddened as he barked, "You'll regret this." David's heart raced, but his eyes remained locked on his betrayer. "The only regret," he said firmly, "is that I trusted you for so long." The room erupted in heated whispers, the tide visibly turning against Michael. For the first time, David felt the power return to his side. That evening, David stood alone in his apartment, city lights glowing through the glass. His reflection stared back, weary yet unbroken. He whispered, "This is my last chance." On the table lay contracts and investment proposals, each a gamble that could either rebuild his fortune or finish him completely. Richard Cole's words echoed, "Bet everything or lose everything." David poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands shaking. He stared at the contracts, feeling the weight of $5 million lost pressing against this moment. He muttered, "All in," as he signed his name across the pages. Lightning flashed outside, the storm mirroring his turmoil. This was no cautious step, it was a leap into fire. If he fell, nothing would remain. If he succeeded, redemption was finally within reach. The next day, David faced Michael again in a closed meeting. Michael's smile returned, cold and venomous. "You think one gamble will save you," he sneered. David leaned forward, eyes sharp. "It's already saving me. You're finished." Michael laughed, but his confidence cracked as David slid across new contracts, revealing allies and investors Michael hadn't expected. Emma entered with more documents, her voice strong. "Independent auditors are already reviewing. By tomorrow, your empire collapses." Michael's fists clenched, his mask of power crumbling. David's heart pounded, but he did not look away. "This ends with me standing," he declared. Silence followed, heavy and final. For the first time, Michael's eyes flickered with fear. That night, David stood on the balcony of his apartment, wind tugging at his jacket. The city below pulsed with neon, a living reminder of the stakes he carried. He gripped the railing, adrenaline still rushing through his veins. "I've risked everything," he whispered. Behind him, Laura Parker entered quietly, her face lined with worry but her presence steady. "You're not alone," she said softly, her hand brushing his arm. For the first time in weeks, David allowed himself a deep breath. The storm of betrayal and ruin had not ended, but he was no longer a victim. He had chosen to fight, and in that choice he found strength again. His eyes burned with determination as he looked at the horizon. Tomorrow would decide everything. The city dawned gray and restless, the skyline veiled in mist. David Parker sat alone in his office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered contracts. The silence felt heavier than any storm. His $5 million loss lingered like a scar, but it was no longer the definition of his story. He whispered, "I survived," the words quiet yet resolute. Laura Parker entered, carrying a file of finalized documents. Her eyes searched him carefully, not for wealth, but for the man she feared she had lost. She placed the file before him, her voice soft but steady. "It's over, David. You've taken back control." He looked at her, exhaustion carved into his face, but a flicker of pride warming beneath. For months he had drowned in betrayal, deception, and ruin, yet somehow he surfaced. He exhaled deeply, the first breath in weeks that did not taste like ash. Though his empire was reduced, his soul remained intact, stronger for the fire it had endured. By midday, David walked through the same trading floor where his collapse began. The screens still glowed with restless charts, traders shouting into phones, but this time he was different. Chaos no longer consumed him, it sharpened him. Emma Lee joined at his side, her tone calm but firm. "They're watching you, waiting for your next move." David nodded, his eyes steady on the numbers racing across the screen. "Let them watch," he replied, voice low but fierce. Every sound in the room reminded him of the moment when 5 million vanished, but now the fear was gone. Where once he froze, now he calculated. Emma glanced at him, her respect clear. The market had nearly broken him, yet it had forged something harder inside. He wasn't the naive entrepreneur anymore. He was someone who knew betrayal, who knew pain, and who had chosen to rise anyway. That evening, David stood across from Michael Grant for the final time. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, as files of evidence stacked high on polished wood. Michael's once confident expression had cracked, sweat beading at his temple. David watched with steady eyes, remembering every betrayal. The judge's gavel struck, each word sealing Michael's downfall. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy, the charges rolled like thunder, each one unraveling the empire Michael built on lies. Emma Lee sat nearby, her gaze proud yet solemn. Richard Cole was absent, but his bitter wisdom echoed in David's mind. Michael turned once toward David, rage and desperation burning together, but David didn't flinch. He leaned forward, whispering just loud enough, "You lost because you underestimated me." The words cut sharper than judgment. For the first time in months, David felt not only free but vindicated. Justice, though imperfect, had finally drawn its line. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the Parker home, warm and golden. David sat at the breakfast table, with Laura and their daughter, laughter returning after months of silence. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The 5 million loss still existed, etched into memory, but it no longer defined him. Laura squeezed his hand softly, smiling with quiet relief. Their daughter chatted about school, her voice filling the room with life. David feared he had lost forever. He looked at them both, realizing wealth could vanish, but this, family, was the true foundation. He whispered, "I almost forgot what mattered," his voice breaking but steady. Laura leaned against him, whispering back, "Now you never will." The storm was over, but its lessons would never fade. That night, David stood on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline, the wind cool against his face. Neon lights painted the streets below, each one a reminder of battles fought and survived. He whispered, They thought I was finished. His eyes glowed with determination, the scars of betrayal still etched within but no longer ruling him. The skyline stretched endlessly, filled with both danger and opportunity. He smiled faintly, not with joy but with defiance. The cost of survival had been immense, yet the man who lost everything was not the man who stood there now. Behind him the city hummed, indifferent, but David was no longer broken. He whispered again, firmer this time, "I will rise." His voice carried into the night, like a vow sealed in steel. The story had begun with collapse, but it ended with fire still burning.